Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great. Good. Today, in the latest episode of the Short and Convoluted History series, though while I will admit that this video is arguably less short and more convoluted than usual, we're going to take a look at Switzerland's Schmidt-Rubin rifles from model 1889 to the model 1911 Carbine. As always, these episodes are meant to be a brief introduction to the subject matter, not an exhaustive exploration. The Schmidt-Rubin in question were Colonels Rudolf Schmidt and Edward Rubin, both of the Swiss Army. Schmidt started out life about as far away from weapons design as you could. He was a grocer who then decided on a career change to textiles. Turns out he wasn't much of a fan of that profession either and decided to pursue his real interest, the design of firearms. He eventually ended up at SIG in 1866, where he was made director of weapons production. He later moved on to Waffenfabrik Bern, a state-owned weapons design and manufacturer, and it is there that he came up with his most famous design, yes, the Schmidt Model 1882 revolver. Okay, no. The famous design would actually come later in the form of a certain straight pull action. Now, as for Rubin, he was a mechanical engineer who, along with weapons design, also happened to be the person who invented the full metal jacket bullet in the form of copper-clad bullets back in 1882. Now, if that wasn't enough, he also happened to come up with an ignition mechanism and replacement for gunpowder in artillery grenades. Now, along with being a colonel in the Swiss military, he was married to Rosina Susanna Leusinger, daughter of famed Swiss cartographer Rudolf Leusinger. He also served as director of the Swiss Federal Ammunition Factory and Research Center in Thun. Now, I won't go too deep into Rubin's activities in his life, but I will say that he was a very well-rounded individual. Prior to 1889, the Swiss had been using the Vetterli rifle, a design which stretched back to the late 1860s. In 1868, when they were adopted into Swiss service, they were a fairly innovative design. They were repeating rifles courtesy of their tubular magazine, one that held a dozen rounds, and could be fired fairly quickly and accurately. By the 1880s, however, the rifle was showing its age. Now, all versions of the Vetterli rifles use the same 10.4 by 38 millimeter rimmed Swiss cartridge, a 41 caliber intermediate bottlenecked black powder rimfire round. So the Swiss embarked on the hunt for a new rifle. Now, it's not uncommon during a design and trials process to start out with one goal and end up somewhere completely different. Now, this is one of those moments in history, however, when a seismic shift in firearms was occurring, which altered not only the trajectory of the new Swiss rifle, but firearms design for the foreseeable future for everyone. About the same time that the Swiss were trying to figure out the replacement to the Vetterli, the French decided to blow up, metaphorically speaking, the world of firearms by introducing the Lebel Model 1886. That rifle, employing an 8mm cartridge, was the first to use smokeless powder and basically rendered everything else in use instantly obsolescent or worse. That, of course, immediately provoked an international competition among countries to at least catch up to the French, most notably Germany, which had just spent a pile of cash to issue the black powder-powered Gewehr 7184 to its soldiers. What would become the new Swiss rifle was initially to have used ammunition with a compressed black powder load, a plan shelved fairly deep in the trials process after smokeless powder arrived. That said, even before the Lebel appeared, they had been pondering the creation of a firearm that wasn't too dissimilar to it. They also wanted a magazine-fed rifle, one that you could feed using something akin to chargers. Now take note of the years. The Lebel was introduced in 1886, while what would become the Schmidt-Rubin Model 1889 had largely taken form by 1888. The Swiss had clearly been on the same track at about the same time as the French. Smokeless powder, of course, brought some big advantages with it. It's obviously a cleaner system that's far less prone to fouling up a rifle. The higher velocities would mean a straighter trajectory, and the load the Swiss settled on would actually generate less chamber pressure than the black powder load they had initially planned on. What was Rubin's contribution to the Schmidt-Rubin rifles? Well, I'm going to disappoint you if you expected that he was toiling alongside Schmidt in the design room. His only contribution was the 7.5 by 53.5 millimeter Swiss round. Now that shouldn't underwhelm you. Most of the rifles at the time were shooting 40 caliber sized bullets. Rubin came in with the comparatively slim 308 diameter bullet, the adoption of which was pretty big at the time. Schmidt, of course, contributed what is likely the most well-known feature of the Schmidt-Rubin rifles, its straight pull action. A lot of people seem to believe that he invented the straight pull, but it was in use before he developed his take on it. In fact, the first successful straight pull rifle was designed by Ferdinand Mannlicher and accepted by the Austro-Hungarian Empire a few years earlier in 1886. The winner of the Swiss trials process was the first in a series of what would be known as the Schmidt-Rubin rifles, in this case the Model 1889. Although it wasn't the first rifle of its kind, it certainly was one of the most advanced. It featured a free-floating barrel and fired that 308 diameter bullet, which was paper patched. Now, just as a side, that GP90 ammunition survived in that form all the way until 1923, when they finally stopped paper patching the bullet, thereby creating the GP90-23 round. Not surprisingly, since Schmidt was involved, the rifle, of course, was a straight pull action. Okay, demonstration time for those of you who may not be familiar with straight pull or traditional bolt actions. Now here is a traditional bolt action that I think most people would be familiar with. We're going to demonstrate this with a Mauser Gewehr 7184, which I of course mentioned earlier in the video. Now as you can see, in order to work the action, you must first lift up the bolt. Continuing on. Now those 4 discrete actions extracted and ejected a spent case, loaded a new round into the chamber, assuming this rifle was loaded, and cocked the striker. Okay, now using this Schmidt-Rubin Model 1911 carbine, or K11 carbine as most people know it as, we can see that there is no lifting up of the bolt. Instead, you pull it back and then push it forward, which accomplishes in 2 discrete actions what it took you 4 discrete actions with a traditional bolt action rifle. So what is the difference? In the first, it's the user that actively rotates the bolt, while in this case, the rifle is accomplishing this through internal mechanical means, namely through camming surfaces. So which one is better, straight pull or traditional bolt action? Well, your stands for straight pull are likely going to bring up talking points like the fact that the order of operations for one is fairly simple. pull back, push forward. They would point out that it would enable a soldier to stay lower thanks to the lack of a chicken winging of a bolt. They might also tell you that pulling and pushing improves the reliability of feeding because you're theoretically able to employ more of your strength. And that's all fair to one degree or another. The tread-bolt crowd would counter that although their preference does feature 4 discrete movements, theirs also tends to have shorter actions, allowing them to complete cycling of a weapon more quickly. And also, depending on the rifle, their finger stays much closer to the trigger, enabling such feats as the Lee Enfield Mad Minute. Finally, they'll also tell you that working the action of a traditional bolt is easier since it's your arm that rotates the bolt, not straight pull cams, which require the bolt to fight against friction and sideways movement while also traveling backwards at the same time. More movements combined in one mechanical action do tend to take more energy to pull off. With traditional bolts, the most resistance you face will either be on the cocking on open or on closed as part of the cycling operation. My opinion has always been that straight pulls are great in theory, but not so much in practice. Straight pull systems were so successful that the only rifles that most people can actually name with them are Schmidt-Rubin, Mannlicher, Ross rifle. The militaries of the world, at least those who tended to fight in wars, clearly had a preference: traditional bolt actions. That said, Schmidt's straight pull design had its advantages and disadvantages. Among its positive attributes is that it did allow rapid bolt movement. It also did a pretty good job of stopping dirt and debris from entering the action. On the negative side of the ledger, however, was that it didn't have very good initial case extraction, and it does tend to need a longer receiver than traditional bolt actions. Getting back to our story, introduced on June 26, 1889, with 211,000 ultimately produced, the M1889 didn't actually last very long. Just a few years later, the model 1896 came into being. The 1889's straight pull action relied on an actuating rod that was set in a channel to the right of the breech to rotate the bolt through a helical channel cut in the bolt sleeve. Now, here's the important part. 2 locking lugs were positioned halfway through the bolt sleeve, which locked the bolt into the receiver directly above the trigger. This was originally done to keep the lugs away from black powder fouling, and it survived even after the Swiss decided on smokeless powder. So among the changes made for the model 1896 and the 1889s, which were reworked into the 89-96 rifles, were moving those locking lugs to the front of the bolt sleeve. Now this had a few practical benefits, which included allowing for higher pressure ammunition and slightly shortening the receiver. Now Schmidt had been asked to do this work, but he flat out refused and probably said something like, "Das Gewehr ist in Ordnung." In other words, no. So instead, Colonel Vogelsang and his co-worker Rebholz did the work in 1892, and in 1896, their rifle was accepted into service. Now it should be noted that after this point, it was Vogelsang and Rebholz who largely undertook the further refinement and development of new Schmidt-Rubin rifle models. Schmidt and Rubin's name would remain on the system, but it was those 2 men, Vogelsang and Rebholz, among other contributors, who did the work. In fact, Schmidt left the directorship of Waffenfabrik Bern in 1894. Now, the following year, in 1897, the Swiss introduced a training rifle, the Schmidt-Rubin Model 1897 single-shot cadet rifle, as their old Vetterli cadet rifles were actually becoming quite scarce. They utilized that new bolt that was brought into being for the Model 1896, ostensibly capable of a more powerful round, but this rifle was intended to fire a reduced power GP90 cartridge. Interestingly though, the rifle sights were marked for both the standard and reduced powder loads. Useful, I suppose, if the 7,900 of these rifles produced needed to be pressed into actual service. The Swiss also decided on a new shorter rifle that would be the Model 1899/1900 short rifle. It was introduced to replace the straight pull Model 1893 Mannlicher Carbine, a rifle so despised by Swiss soldiers that they allegedly intentionally smashed them during drills in an effort to destroy them. It was intended to be issued to the artillery corps and others who needed a shorter, handier rifle. Now, although it has 1899 in the designation, the Swiss didn't actually start designing it until early 1900 and didn't issue it until the following year. They ended up producing about 19,000 of them over the following decade. These actually tend to be fairly rare rifles today, as most of them were converted into K11 carbines a few years down the line. Next up was the Schmidt-Rubin 1896/11 rifle. This model was an upgrading to the Model 1889-96 and 1896 rifles. Now, this was primarily done so the rifles could use the new GP11 cartridge, essentially finalized in 1907, which had a higher chamber pressure. Now, while they were there, the Swiss also remarked the sights, necessary of course because of this new cartridge, expanded magazine capacity to 6 rounds, added a short pistol grip, and redid the barrels to a 4-groove pattern from 3 grooves. Now, virtually all of those 89-96 rifles I mentioned earlier were converted to the new 96/11 pattern. Now, just a note, the GP11 round saw the ammunition change from 7.5 by 53.5 to 7.5 by 55. These rounds are not interchangeable, and it's a really bad idea to fire GP11 out of a rifle designed for GP90, as everything before the Model 1896/11 is. So don't shoot GP11 out of the models 1889 and 1896. We finally arrived to the final stars of the show, the Model 1911 and Carabiner 1911. With the introduction of the GP11 cartridge, the Swiss are faced with a few issues. The first is that the new cartridge didn't shoot particularly well out of the older rifles because their chambers and throats were designed for the paper-patched bullets of the GP90. The second is that the old rifles were also long and fairly heavy. Although no one knew it at the time, the next war, the Great War, would see an increasingly number of standard rifles that were, at least comparatively speaking, the exact opposite of that. There were an increasing number of rifles appearing that were lighter and far handier. Now, as I mentioned earlier, virtually all of the Model 1896 rifles had been converted over to a new pattern, but that wasn't enough to arm the entire Swiss army, so a new rifle was needed. In 1909, the Swiss held a series of trials where they tested 3 new rifles based on the proven Schmidt-Rubin design: a traditional long rifle, a short rifle, and a carbine. Now, I don't think I'm going to spoil this story by telling you that the long rifle and carbine were chosen by the Swiss. Now, when I said proven design, I wasn't joking. The 2 new firearms were basically accepted as is after the trials. The first of the winning rifles that was eventually introduced in 1911 didn't really fit the new paradigm of smaller and lighter, the Model 1911 rifle. In most ways, it was still your bog standard old school rifle. It was about 10 pounds empty and 51½ inches long, and was more of an iterative step forward that combined several features from previous models. That said, it also featured all of the improvements that had been introduced with previous rifles. And that includes that pistol grip, this time integrated into the stock rather than just dovetailed on, moving the locking lugs from the rear to the middle of the bolt, as they had already done with the 8996, the removal of a magazine cutoff, and an improved trigger guard to accommodate a new magazine. You'll also find that they have a squared-off buttstock compared to the older Schmidt-Rubin rifles. And yes, it used that new GP11 cartridge. The Swiss eventually produced about 127,000 Model 1911s between 1913 and 1919. Along with the Model 1911, however, the Swiss committed to something a little more interesting, the K11 carbine. It was manufactured concurrently with the Model 1911 rifle. Now, apart from the obvious difference in length, there are some minor differences between the K11 and the Model 1911. For example, comparing the two side by side, you'd see the rear sight is a little bit shorter. Now, as with many of the rifles going back many years, these rifles may have used the original Schmidt-Rubin paradigm, but they were still the responsibility of the aforementioned Colonel Vogelsang and his assistants. The K11 originally began life with the intention of a carbine version of the M1911 to be issued to the types of soldiers that needed a short rifle, artillery, cavalry, and the like. But it proved to be popular among all infantry troops. It's easy to see why. The carbine was mere 8.85 pounds empty and was only 43.6 inches long. And although the original plan was to limit the carbine to those specialized soldiers, the Swiss realized pretty quickly that the future was the carbine, not the full-length rifle. See, although the Swiss didn't fight in World War I, they, like everyone else, learned some pretty important lessons. The biggest, both metaphorically and literally, was that rifles needed to be shorter, lighter, and handier. Combat had changed, technologically and tactically, and that demanded a different kind of standard issue weapon. Perhaps as a testament to its popularity, the K11 also started production in 1913, but it continued on being produced until 1933, with a total of 185,000 rolling off assembly lines. The Swiss also converted the Model 1900 and 1905 short rifles to the K11 pattern. Those two rifles are pretty rare these days, given that virtually all of them were changed over. Part of this demand occurred because of World War I. Like I said, the Swiss may have been neutral, but they realized that neither side was going to necessarily respect their territorial integrity if push came to shove. So the Swiss increased the size of their military to signal to both sides that it would defend itself if necessary. And that prompted ongoing demand for the Model 1911 and K11 carbine. So what about the Carabiner Model 1931, or K31 as it's popularly known? Well, although it is based on the Schmidt-Rubin rifles, it was in essence a whole new design by Colonel Adolf Führer of the Waffenfabrik in Bern. So I'm not going to cover it today. There were enough changes made to that system for the K31 that I consider it to be a whole new class of rifle with only a slight connection to its predecessors. Perhaps it'll be the future subject of its own, a short and convoluted history of episode. I find the legacy of the Schmidt-Rubin family of rifles to be a bit difficult to nail down, only because they weren't combat tested by the Swiss, which I actually think is a good thing. It's probably for that reason that they stuck with the Schmidt-Rubin design as long as they did. I think had the rifles actually seen action in World War I, we would have either seen larger changes to the system or its abandonment for traditional bolt-action design. It is far easier to maintain a complicated design in peacetime, after all. If we get down to brass tacks, they were rifles that were more complicated than traditional bolt actions and more expensive to produce. Now, the Swiss have a long history of expensive and complicated rifles. The Sturmgewehr 57 is ultimate proof of that. But I think they would have poured that money and effort into equally accurate rifles using a different system. Now, if you want me to pin me down to a position, I'd have to reluctantly state that the Schmidt-Rubin rifles were the kind of firearm that survived and evolved because their users never actually had to use them in anger. That's not to say that they wouldn't have been effective arms in the hands of a people who prided themselves on marksmanship. Just that the same thing could have been rendered with a less complicated and expensive design. Ultimately, however, the Swiss did have a fine family of rifles in the Schmidt-Rubin era, and we collectors today are fortunate to be able to experience their quality and accuracy today. At any rate, I hope you found today's video to at least be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, have yourself a great day. Take care, and bye-bye.